Good morning, afternoon, and thank you for investing your time to join our discussion today. I'm Emma, and I'm on the marketing team here at SafePass, and I'm delighted to be joined by an amazing panel today for how to identify and remediate conflicts before your audit, where we'll be talking about the whys and the hows of conducting a health check sooner rather than later. So our goal today is that you leave the session with a deep understanding and a fresh perspective and a new strategy that you can implement in your own organizations to be successful. So after all, you don't know what the auditor is going to find, so it's a good idea to be prepared beforehand. So we'll start off with some very brief introductions from the panel, and then we'll dive right into the nitty-gritty of the session, which is why you are all here today. So let's get started. Brian, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi there. Brian, I'm one of the directors of Searchlight Consulting, and basically the area that I focus on is this whole area of technology-enabled change from a business and business process and an operating model perspective. And within that, one of the things that we look at is this whole area of risk, compliance, and controls of businesses as they are going through technology-enabled change and digital transformation. I'll say a little bit more about what we do in a minute.
Great, thanks for that, Brian. Scott?
Good morning, everyone from sunny Austin, Texas. Although it won't be sunny for a few hours yet. My name is Scott Eloquin, and I am the Chief Revenue Officer for SafePass. And I've actually been in big ERP systems for about 25 years, first with Big Four Consulting. Also was an IT director for several years, and then actually ran a regional Oracle consulting firm for about 17 years.
Great stuff. And Navinda?
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everyone. Navinda Kaplish. So my background is I've focused on delivering governance, risk, and compliance systems for a number of years. I used to be at Deloitte and Ernst & Young, have led various programs in this space with different ERP systems, Oracle, SAP, PeopleSoft, and have played various roles like auditor or internal controls for clients. So sort of have the background of sort of sitting at different seats across, on this table.
Fantastic. So as you can see, we have an amazing panel lined up for you today. So Brian, if you'd like to give us a brief, a brief explanation of who Searchlight are.
Yeah. So thanks, Emma. Yeah. So we're independent business and technology change consultancy, basically. And I've listed here some of the things that we do in the area of sort of finance or topics that we think might be of interest to the finance community, which I think most of the audience is. But fundamentally, we're looking at areas of digital change, technology-enabled change, and really just trying to make that successful. So whatever the goal is, whether that's compliance, whether it's about organization alignment and shared services, whether it's just about applications modernization or process optimization, or something more tangible, if you like working capital or business spend management, then really what we're about is trying to help clients make good decisions and be successful with those change programs.
Great, thank you. And Scott?
Sure. So for those who aren't familiar with SafePass, we've been around for, well, in our current incarnation, about 17 years, but actually the firm was really founded on internal controls, GRC products, even before GRC was cool. And if you look at this particular slide, SafePass really has been a thought leader for almost 2 decades now. Product itself is in Gartner's quadrant for really fully integrated risk management solutions. Our CEO, Adil Khan, actually co-authored the GRC handbook for Oracle applications. And we have if you go to our website, you're going to find a lot of information around best practices and a lot of things that are going on in the space. And I think the thing that's most relevant from my perspective is that, in the age of COVID, all of a sudden you've got fragmented workforces. You've got a lot of people sitting at home conducting their old job, but in a disconnected way. And the ability to really knit those things together, it's funny, you kind of take the emphasis, which has been on cybersecurity and network security and intrusion security, but there's also the access security part, the part that says that I'm going to make sure the right people get into my system. But once you get into the system, I'm going to make sure that the person that gets into my system actually can do the things that they're supposed to do. which is really going to be the focus of this session today. And if you go to the next slide, so if you think about it, from SafePass's perspective, the 15-second sales pitches that we do have a platform that does a lot of different things. We do the access controls, we do continuous monitoring, we do process control, so we can knit those together and automate processes and pull it together in really an audit framework. What we're going to focus on today, though, is really about the access controls. And of access controls, there's really three components. The first is making sure that people who get into the system can do the things that they want, that you want them to be able to do. The second thing is to be able to fix those things, and the third is to prevent those things from happening. We're going to focus on the first part. Who's getting in, what can they do, and what does that look like? And that's really, we're going to narrow down our scope of this discussion.
Thank you, Scott. So this is the agenda we're going to be following today. So basically how problems start, why address them, and how to get started. So feel free to send across any questions during the session, and we'll try to get to those either during the session or at the end. So Brian, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile putting this area of access controls in context, and some of that overview that Scott just gave around the application suite really sort of starts to place it in the scheme of a much bigger picture. And if you look at the middle column here, what we're basically focusing in on is the middle there, the information security data protection as it relates to the technology and applications that are used. But it's got to recognize that all that control framework and the management of risk and compliance sits within a broader framework of activities and needs to consider not only what's happening inside the organization, but also what happens with third parties. And really, the whole intention and where it starts is at the access controls bit, and what we're trying to avoid, and I'll ask Navinda to chip in a little bit, but what we're trying to avoid are the problems that are in the red on the left-hand side and get the benefits that are on the right-hand side. So Navinda, do you want to just add a bit of color to some of the consequences and the benefits side of this?
Sure, Brian. So I think consequences, it sort of depends on which country or which jurisdiction you're in. So if you're a US listed business, then you need to be Sarbanes-Oxley compliant. And within Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, you've got various types of controls. IT general controls are quite a critical part of that, especially for systems like ERP systems, which normally have your accounting information and financial information. So the penalties for, well, I guess one penalty is when you file your returns with the SEC, you need to give the CFO and the CEO need to actually sign off, saying, giving a status about their internal controls. And this really came about as a result of Enron, and we know how severe the consequences there were. So if you don't look at this area, especially for your critical ERP systems, there's a significant impact on brand, and there's also potentially a financial impact.
Scott, have you got any views on those some of those benefits there, and whether people are doing enough to achieve those benefits?
Well, I think people do what they know, right? I think if you know that there's some things you could do, that if I do this, I can lower costs, or if I do this, I can automate a process, I think people do it. I mean, to me, people are so busy, they've got so much going on that it's hard to prioritize those things. So if it hits the list, I think that they achieve those benefits. I think the real issue that I see, Brian, is that people don't get a comprehensive view of all the opportunities and all the risks in the business, so that they don't have the ability to kind of prioritize things, or in like regard, group them together. There may be several initiatives that if you did all these together, you get a huge benefit, but taking one at a time, they don't really have any benefit at all. So I think that probably the main reason why I think that this particular webinar is important is our goal is to kind of turn the lights on so they can see what those things are, so that they can make those choices.
Cool. Yeah. So what we're going to focus in on then is this starting point really around access controls and segregation of duties. And I thought it'd be worthwhile just talking through where these problems can potentially manifest themselves, particularly if you're going through a new systems implementation project, but then also, you know, how do you manage to maintain this in a business as usual environment? So there's basically, you know, there is a life cycle that people go through when they are looking at the applications and the systems and the technology that underpins the way in which the business works. So let's take a typical ERP type of scenario, which has finance at the core of it. Then there's a life cycle that goes through the preparation and approval right the way through to the deployment stage. And all the way along that journey, you basically have the opportunity to introduce problems. Not through any malicious intent, but basically just through not paying particular attention to this whole topic of building in those segregations of duties. And it starts, and Navinda, you were raising this with me before, it starts with a lack of senior management focus on what the control objectives are at the very beginning of a program. You want to comment on that, Navinda?
Yeah, I mean, so when you're running a transformation program, let's say you're implementing a new ERP system, or you're upgrading from your current, for example, Oracle release 12 to a cloud system. Generally, what people tend to focus on are actually the duration of the project, getting the key deliverables in. For example, doing the design, build, data migration, UAT, which is all perfectly fine. But what gets missed normally is the focus on controls. There is a significant controls impact on your internal controls environment with such projects. And unless somebody who's in the leadership, ideally the overall program director, thinking about controls and the impact of it, impact of the new implementation, they get missed. And you could end up in a situation where actually you end up worse than you were with the previous system from a controls perspective, and remediation generally ends up costing quite a lot. So I think it all begins with senior management focus on it. And if you've got an audit committee in your business, they really should be worried about looking at those aspects as part of any transformation programs.
Yeah.
But I think,
sorry, Scott, yes.
Well, to me, I think part of the problem is that project manager and the CFO is worried about on time, on budget, and a bunch of talking about stuff slows stuff down. And if I'm the VP of engineering, I know exactly what my controls are. I know what I care about, and I'm going to make sure the software does that. If I'm the CAO, the chief accounting officer, I've got a whole different set of metrics. So having an enterprise set of controls where people go, okay, I get what we really care about, broad spectrum across the company. I don't think those discussions happen. I think that within the module areas or within the domain areas, they do.
Yeah, and I think that from my experience, when you look at how people set about specifying the configuration of the system, there is a bit of a focus on, generally there is a focus on mapping those processes against the organization and the roles in the organization. But actually, you know, in order to specify how those controls are executed in the business, you have to get right down to the transaction level within systems. And then you also have to couple that with the whole bit about how the organization is represented in the system, and whether not only which transactions do roles get access to, but also is there any restriction on which company codes people have, or which material groups they have the ability to change, or which customer groups. So do you then break it down more? So there's a lot of detailed mapping that needs to take place. And I know we're going to look at the Oracle model in a little bit. And I guess the thing is that as you say, Scott, as you're racing towards delivery of time and cost and trying to deliver a functional working system, it's all too easy to neglect that level of detail in the design to enable you to build the profiles alongside the configuration of the system. The other bit that we see is that even if you were to do that design, then and you can build the profiles, the building of profiles, the specification of profiles tends to lag behind the main process configuration part of the build and test. And I think building into both the tracker side of things, but also building in some sort of sign-off and approval process that makes sure that one, that the profile designs are being done, and secondly, that they're achieving their objective, I think is key. within the testing stage, so I'm sort of moving from left to right here, within the testing stage, then there's generally a portion of testing where you're trying to test the core functionality and the core configuration and the core processes. And at that point, you're probably not going to be applying access controls and profile design on top of that. That gets added afterwards once you've managed to make sure that the core process works as it's intended to in systems integration testing. And it's when you get to what's making sure that you do apply the profiles during testing that's quite a key step that a lot of people I think don't do very well actually. I don't know whether either of you have got any comments on that sort of whole bit about testing with profiles or without profiles.
In my experience, people most of the time the pressure's on in terms of finishing milestones by a certain date, and it's not normal that folks have the exact profiles they'll have at go live. There's always compromises, and again, it comes down to having a focus on controls. I think that there should really be a check before go live in terms of have a matrix of users and their roles and check that against either if you have a segregation of duties matrix in house, or if you have somebody looking at controls from your internal controls team or your internal audit team, they should look at that, because that's the point at which everybody's stressed out about going live at the right time, but nobody really looks at on day one what kind of access and controls issues you might end up having.
Yeah, and I think the one of the key things is that best practice is to design access controls via roles, and of course jobs are not necessarily equivalent to roles. So somebody may have multiple roles in an organisation within their job, and the way in which a job is constructed is likely to be different if you're in a different size of organisation. So if you're in a widely spread organisation with business units of different sizes, the way in which those roles are consumed, if you like, by the users is going to vary job to job, from site to site, from business to business. So the combination of roles in one business in order to make a job might be different in another area. And if you've got a large organisation, you may well have greater separation of activities. And the key thing there is that at that deployment stage, what happens is, firstly, that mapping, as you talked about just then, Navinder, the mapping of the individuals to their appropriate roles in order to execute the process, oftentimes gets done quite late in the process. And then you get the situation whereby when you go live, you want to avoid problems at go live in terms of being able to transact in the business. And there's a great tendency at that point to lose control of those profile designs. And if Mary in accounts needs to do something and she can't do it because that transaction hasn't been included in the role, then somebody quickly does it in order to keep the business running. And over time, what happens then is that the efficacy, the integrity of those roles starts to erode over time if you don't have strong control processes in place. And then the final bit there is about, at the point when you've gone live, it's about what do you do when someone changes job? When do you do when someone leaves, someone's joined, someone's moves? How do you manage all that process? Has anyone got any comments on any of those points that I've just made?
User administration, joiners, leavers, and movers tends to be a single point of failure in terms of segregation duties conflicts. Unless you have a really robust process, you can use automated tools for that. SafePass has a tool, or you could do it manually, but really it needs to be a slick process. That's where a lot of issues get introduced in my experience.
And I guess the thing I would add, Brian and Navinder both, for the people that are dialed in right now, and they saw all the red in the first chart, and they saw, so systems have problems and implementations have problems. I guess the thing that I would suggest to you is it's okay, because every system has problems. Unless you specifically prevent these things from happening, things just kind of they unravel naturally. So it's okay that we are where we are. And the good news is ERP systems are configurable. We can test these things and you can fix it. And you don't have to turn it into a big thing. Just understanding what the issues are means you have a path going forward. I think that my fear is that people said, oh, I'm going to watch a risk controls audit webinar and it's going to be a bunch of gloom and doom. It's really not. I just want to give you guys some sense of comfort that there's actually a path forward.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, even if you just raise awareness of the types of issues that can happen, and then figure out how you're going to mitigate that risk and what particular steps you're going to put into your project in order to mitigate and address those problems and try and prevent them from happening, then that's what we wanted to try and do here. Really, I guess it's to raise awareness of where and how these problems creep in.
Exactly.
Great.
Well, let's take a little brief look at the ERPs we're focusing on today, Oracle, eBusiness Suite, and ERP Cloud. Navinder?
Yes, so I don't want to get into too much technical details, so I'll try and give a high-level overview. So the reason we pick these examples is that basically for every ERP system brings with it a lot of coordination across the business, a lot of integration of different areas. So your HR, your finance, your procurement, inventory, all of those teams are working with the same system, and what happens in one reflects in the other. What happens in one subledger reflects in the main general ledger, for example. But the other aspect of the ERP systems is that they're actually quite complex. So as an example, Oracle Release 12, which is also known as eBusiness Suite, a really complex system, 35,000 functions and 12,500 menus. So to keep it simple, function, when you read 35,000 functions, it means 35,000 individual forms which people can go into and do things. And menus are basically a collection of forms. So the model there, you have users and then responsibilities and menus and functions. And there are all sorts of ways where your controls can be weakened. I mean, you might have a really good segregation of duties model on paper, but when the responsibilities are being configured, you might have, in an inquiry responsibility for accounts payables, inadvertently, you might have access to raising an invoice, or you think you're able to view suppliers, but you can actually modify suppliers. And we've seen that in a number of places, at a number of clients. It's not because your support teams are malicious. It's because sometimes human errors happen, because these are complex systems with complex configurations. So having an automated way of reviewing access controls is a really good idea, because in today's day and age we've automated a lot of things, but some of these aspects are not automated. As ERP Cloud is the new ERP version from Oracle. It's all in the cloud, similar model but slightly different terminology. You've got roles instead of responsibilities, you've got privileges instead of functions, but the concept is the same. You've got fundamentally you have access to forms that allow you to do things. They allow you either to read only, or they allow you to modify data, or they allow you to do configuration changes in the system. And your overall application security model really depends on how this has been configured. Also, I mean, the role design should be based on what people need, and should really follow the principle of least privilege, as we call in audit. You shouldn't have more access than you need. I mean, if you need to have access only to read, you shouldn't have access to make transactions, for example. And user provisioning process, we should touched upon it in a previous slide. In my experience, that process is probably the biggest reason after go live for having controls issues, because companies normally don't build it in a way whereby the right people are approving access. Normally you have your supervisors approving access, and if you're sitting in for example inventory, and you're requesting access to general ledger, and your supervisor is friendly and says, oh, I know what Jim is doing, and he just keeps approving access, I mean, they've certainly given you access to a whole different area in the business, and the general ledger manager in the business probably doesn't even know about it. So those you might think that this is these simplistic examples are not common. Believe me, they're very common, and you sort of need to look at this holistically. You define the roles properly, you maintain them effectively with the user provisioning process, you review them periodically, you review accesses periodically, and it's like it's a process that takes effort to put in the first time, but it's easy to maintain once you get it right. A number of ERP environments as well. I mean, do you have multiple systems? I mean, at a previous client we had Oracle in one part of the business, SAP in another part of the business, and they also had legacy JD Edwards. So you really need to sort of, as a responsible stakeholder in your business, review that and think about the security model from that perspective. I think that's a lot of talking about that particular slide. If anybody has any detailed questions, we can pick them up. But hopefully that gives you a good picture.
Okay, well, let's pause there for a moment and have a little bit of fun with the poll we've put together. So how many of you can confidently say that you can answer the following questions with a yes before your audit? Let's take a look. Lavinder?
Well, that is our checklist to make sure we've thought about all aspects. So not sure what the audience thinks, but do your roles, the roles you've created, do they meet your requirements? Do you have good user provisioning processes like we talked about? Do you monitor what your super users do? I mean, super users are your administrators who might end up having access to a lot more than they really need to. In my experience, super users or support teams should really only have access to configuration, but they frequently have access to master data. They have access to transactions, thereby breaking good practice segregation of duties rules. How do you check access periodically? Do you have a process in place and the technology in place to be able to detect segregation of duties policy violations? Do you have access to sensitive data and functions? I mean, these are areas, segregation duties and sensitive access are areas where there needs to be some thinking in the business to define what that means before you go about looking for it. If you don't know what your segregation duties rules are, you've never done that exercise, then it's unlikely you'll be able to define them properly. And maintaining audit trail on ERP configuration controls is not so relevant for the topic today, but basically you must have some tracking of changes to your key configuration items because they impact the whole system. Master data changes are similar to your sensitive data and functions because master data typically is vendors, employees, customers, chart of accounts in general ledger, important data points, and levers and movers. I mean, the number of times you go and see a client, a mature client who's been running a particular ERP system for donkey's years, don't have a good process around levers. People who have left the organization a year ago still have an active user account. Not to say that they've logged in and done anything, but a simple thing like removing access is such a difficult process at times. So these are all the aspects that we normally check on, and I guess this is similar to what if you had an external auditor or an internal auditor looking at this particular area for a project, they would probably end up checking all of these aspects as well. So a specialist
can I just stop you there, Navinda, because we have had a question come in, and Robert asks, so we do have an audit firm that comes in yearly to review these types of risks. So is this exercise redundant?
Is that an internal audit firm? I mean, do they support you from an internal audit perspective? Are they external audit? Are they advisors? If you've got somebody who knows your ERP system, so let's say for argument's sake you've got Oracle Release 12. If they're folks who specialize in the Oracle R12, but aspects of audit and security and controls, and they're doing your reviews, they've got well-defined segregation duties rules. They're helping you define business process controls, which is a different area, and they're checking against them. Then I guess you're one of the companies that actually is doing this quite well. Is that the question, Robert? I'd also ask is, are those tests and are those checks done manually? Because frequently some of these systems are complex. You need to spend a lot of time and money periodically because you've got spreadsheets or a manual process. So could you make that easier by having automated tools? Perhaps we're thinking about, but if you've covered all of this via a specialist firm, then you probably are covered from a services perspective.
Yeah, I guess it depends on whether you can just present the evidence of whether you've got your controls and whether you are compliant, and then they just check on exceptions in order to be able to approve the audit. rather than then having to do all the analysis, because I'm pretty damn sure that they're probably charging you a much higher day rate than your employees cost if you're in control of the process in the first instance.
Well, I think that's right. I think that the bottom line is these activities have to happen. Can you do it for yourself, or somebody to do it for you? And trying to understand what that looks like. Agreed.
Absolutely. So why should an organization perform a health check?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Emma. So it's funny. I do see a lot of people that they feel like, well, I run an ERP system, the controls are in place. You know, I can't ship an order without, you know, the customer satisfying a credit check. The controls are in place, and there are many, many controls in place in an ERP system. I think the thing that's different is that for the people that set up the ERP system, you can make it do a lot of different things. You can have a general ledger user have ability to go do things in inventory, because within Oracle ERP Cloud and eBusiness Suite, you can set up customer responsibilities, which, by the way, has the license impact as well. There's a lot of downstream things that could happen as a result of that. The fact that it's so configurable means that you have to make sure that it's configured the right way. And honestly, the fact that it was, I'm going to make up two numbers for you, but these are fairly accurate. The fact that eBusiness Suite was initially architected in probably 1991, and Fusion ERP Cloud began to be built out in probably 2004, 2005, means there's a lot of batch processes. There's a lot of steps in between that you have to monitor the activities that leave room for fraud, for risk, for inefficiency, for a lot of different things. So to me, the health check is the thing that lets you look inside the box and understand what's going on. And I will tell you the example that came to mind for me when I was preparing for this webinar is that I had a 1987 pickup truck, which was amazing. I was very popular with every guy at Home Depot that had a ponytail. They wanted to talk about my 87 pickup truck. But the problem is that I didn't have visibility to what was going on inside the motor. And so to me, you know, a light would come on, but then it wouldn't, and I wasn't really sure. And I would have to I'd have to listen very carefully to make sure that it wasn't a problem. And at some point, without really realizing it, it was degrading over time. And if I caught it earlier, I would probably still have that pickup truck, which I no longer have. You know, now I go and I get in my newer car, which is not that new, but it's got a little module under the dash. And you plug the thing in, you punch up your iPhone, it's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that this was going on inside my car. Gee, I should plan this out. I should do this. I should, you know, go replace that. And it's giving me visibility to address things in a timely fashion. At the time, instead of having it degrade as I'm driving home on a highway and having to pull over, it's like, oh, I'll need to deal with this in the next 4 weeks. The health check really is that. We want to turn the lights on inside your system so you can see what's going on, so that you can go, wow, there's some things that need to happen here. And it's going to give you a lot of benefits in terms of looking inside the box. And so to me, there's a lot of remediation, a lot of plans that I'll leave it to smarter guys like Brian and the vendor. I think from SafePass's perspective, we have this enterprise platform, and we want to activate a small portion of it so that you can actually look inside your system and you can make some decisions. So for me, there's really 3 parts of that. And for the people on the call, you're, you know, based on the attendee list that I saw, you're either running systems or you audit systems. Do you understand how this works? People show up and they have a series of scripts and programs. They pull lots of data. They look at natural conflicts within the system. And unfortunately, because conflicts are not very granular, or they're very granular, but they don't really rate the priority of them, you end up lots and lots and lots of different conflicts. So I've got $100 in petty cash shows up as a conflict, just like I can make $1 million, you know, miscellaneous journal entry, same conflict. And so the process that we go through, that we recommend, is that one is that you really need to run your programs on your system and identify those violations. You need to pull all this together. And then for the way that we do it is we actually rate those. So we run it through our policy engine. And based on that, we look at the materiality, we look at the frequency, and we try to give you a sense of by domain area, by system, by business flow, where those problems are really manifesting themselves. And then clearly there are going to be some things that you as a business decide that you allow that an ERP system cannot natively check. Maybe it's around IT super users and you just want to monitor what they're doing. Maybe it's around small sales offices where you're going to have people with duplicate functions because they have no choice. So we give you the ability to kind of go through and identify those things that would be excluded from the report. And then and Emma, if you want to go to the next page, what we do is we generate lots and lots of different metrics and give you the detail around this so you can now dig in and define where the problems are. And Navendra, I'll actually hand this off to you if you want to talk about the reason for some of these and how you would use them.
Yeah, I mean, basically a dashboard that's less text and more visual is generally quite a good tool, especially for senior executives, because you don't need to sort of look at an output spreadsheet which is running into thousands of lines. I think what we're trying to do here is give a snapshot of what the potential issues are. I mean, one of them, the first one there is top 10 SOD rules with violations. So if it looks like there are lots of rules in the procure to pay space where you've got violation issues, but not so many on the fixed assets or inventory space, then it probably means that in your procure to pay organization, you need to think about how access is designed and how your operating model is, because you're not following good practice segregation of duties controls. So that's an easy way to see which area you need to focus on. The other one, of course, the next two, I can't of course cover all of these, but the next two, top 10 responsibility with violations or roles as we have now in Fusions. So if there are roles or responsibilities that inherently have an SOD violation, that means they've not been designed correctly. So you need to go into that, going to those particular examples and look at how you can improve the design of the roles, because eventually there should not be any responsibilities or roles with violations inherent in them. That's just bad design, unless you have other mitigating controls, and that's a discussion you can have internally once you see this. And the top 10 violation users, I mean, typically what you end up seeing is you've got a support team that nobody really looks at on a day-to-day basis, but half that team has access that's a lot more than required, far in excess of what they normally need. And you might see a lot of them on this top 10 users list, or you may not. You may have a different part of the business. Maybe in general ledger, there are lots of people who are able to enter and post journals and open and close accounting periods, which is not good practice. So again, the top 10 violation users will give you an idea of where in the business you should look at and where you should reconsider perhaps your operating model from a business perspective and look at the actual access assigned in your ERP system.
Well, and Navendra, what I love about this is that, I mean, the bottom line is there's a lot of things you can do to address these violations or to improve the business. I just want to know about it. An auditor is going to come in, they're going to pull this exact same information, and they're going to sit down with my boss's boss and say, here's what we found in purchasing. Here's what's going on with the IT super users. I want to know that in advance before they come. So that when they say, oh, by the way, Jim has the ability to do this and that, we can say, well, actually, we know that. Here's why, here's the approval. And by the way, we've been monitoring his or her transaction. So to be able to know what we're going to be graded on in advance so that A, we can fix it, or B, we can explain it so that we don't get surprised is really, I think, the most valuable part of this exercise. Brian, anything to add?
No, not on that. I think if you click onto the next one, Emma, I think the key thing is that information is great, advice is great, but at the end of the day, you have to take action against it. Now, sometimes, as Scott just said, you might just want to, in advance, you've got evidence, and then you can rationalize it as to why it's happening and what you can do to change it. But it's really critical. It's a bit like if you go to your doctor and have a health checkup, if you don't then change some of the things that you're doing in your diet, your exercise, or whatever else, then actually the next time you go back, situation's going to be worse. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. So you've got to look at the output of the health check and see it as if it's all green, if it's all fine, then obviously that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Carry on doing what you're doing, but the things that do come up, you've got to put them in perspective, got to prioritize, and really drive through on the ownership and the changes that you need and the remediations that you need in order to prevent that issue from either reoccurring, degrading even further, or just being in a better position over time. So there's just a simple 6-step framework here on what to do when you get those results, and what you can do then to try and prevent problems reoccurring by putting in place some processes around continuous monitoring or periodic review. If anyone's I come from a supply chain background, so inventory management. It's the difference between doing the annual stock check and doing continuous stock counts and checks to make sure that the quantities that you've got and the position of the items and everything else in the warehouse is right. And if you go into that cycle of continually doing it, it becomes second nature. You're able to remediate it before it becomes a big problem, and that's really ultimately where we want to get to with this. So the health check is a bit like the annual one, but you could do it on a periodic basis. So I think it's important that once you get the results from doing a health check and you recognise the benefits that we've outlined, that you then actually do something with that information. I had a client once that said all good consulting advice can be ignored, but I think in this particular instance, ignore things at your peril. Do we have any
everybody want to add anything there? Scott, Lavinder?
I thought Brian covered that beautifully for this slide.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd add there, Emma, is this is really aimed at folks who who want to basically get a health check at a point in time and basically protect themselves from any surprises during audit. So it's really appealing for if you're a senior leader in your organization, it's probably going to be appealing for you.
Okay, great stuff. And before we come to the end, we have had a couple of questions come in. So Jennifer asks, okay, so we run multiple systems. We run Oracle for ERP, Salesforce for CRM, and ASP for our payroll. So how does this affect the way that I would prepare for an audit?
So I'll start on that, Emma. I think so. The first thing is to understand the processes that are running on those applications and the end-to-end picture. And being able to identify where the controls are, the control points are that you need to have in those end-to-end processes. From a point of view of the using a tool like SafePath, I'll have Lavinder and Scott to comment on how that's applicable in a multi-application environment.
Yeah, I think what I'd say there is, Jennifer, I think the first step is, I mean, what we're talking about, if you take a step back, is looking at risk and risk in terms of materiality in your business. So if you're using let's say you're using an Oracle ERP system and that's your main financial accounting software, then you really need to think about what the risks are. I mean, eventually there are two types of risks that Segregation of Duties focuses on. One is fraud risk. If somebody is able to, for example, set up their brother-in-law as a supplier and then process invoices for them and make payments, that's a fraud risk, money leaking out of the business. And it has happened. It does happen. And the second type of risk is misrepresentation of accounting information. If you've got folks in finance who can go in and bake the books or fudge numbers periodically because there are targets not being met, and they can cover up at the end of the month and then go back and reverse it, then that's the misrepresentation of accounting information risk. So when you've got these number of systems that you mentioned, you need to basically take a step back and think about which of these systems are I guess, more important from a risk management perspective, higher materiality impacts if something goes wrong, and start focusing on those. I mean, Brian's mentioned the end-to-end processes, which would be the next step. You basically look at how the processes underneath, and then start evaluating those systems one by one. I mean, you could use tools, for example, in SafePath, we are sort of agnostic because we do support multiple tools, but really the thinking should start from where is the risk and why are you worried about it. If it's a system where it's very small amount of transactions that happen, doesn't have a significant financial impact, I would probably not bother about that. And we call this as a risk-based approach from an audit perspective. Take a risk-based approach at the top level and then go down. And we can of course have a conversation about that later if you want to get into more detail.
And of course, I mean, we focus quite heavily on the sort of those controls that relate primarily to a financial situation, but certainly if you're in Europe and the UK, then we've got a whole load of personal data protection legislation under what GDPR that also applies. You need to make sure that particularly personal information about your customers or your employees or whatever is only visible and accessed and edited and managed by people who have the right level of authorization to do so. So there's the financial implication side of it, and then there's the data protection side of things as well, which has to be considered.
Good point, Brian.
Well, and as the ERP guy on the panel, I'll just say that, with great flexibility becomes great complexity. I mean, to me, we see a lot of customers that run Oracle e-Business Suite, and then the salesperson buys Salesforce, and the next thing you know, they're trying to book orders over here and do demand reservation. And so all of a sudden you've created a much more complex application architecture. So the one thing I would say from an audit risk perspective is that you need to be very mindful of how not just users and access is set up, but how those transactions are flowing and how the business is working, because it's no longer in one system. And it's great to be able to pick your e-commerce site and your CRM. It's great to have a field depot repair thing or something like that where you pull those together, but you just have to recognize that at some point when you do a business flow of the transaction, it may cut across multiple systems, which, like I was kind of making fun of Oracle earlier for being a batch system that was developed initially in 1990, while creating more silos of information and knitting those together from an audit risk perspective becomes especially important. So whether you have a tool that does it or you really lock down those business processes, I think it's really important to not just assume that's the salesperson system, that's the engineering person system, that's the financial system. They're one application architecture, whether it's conceptual or physical. So you have to manage it as such.
Exactly. Any closing comments from any of the panel before we wrap up?
I think the one thing I would say about this particular health check, and it looks like you have the one pager that's on the screen, we want to make it possible for customers to see what's in their system. We have the tool already built. This particular process, it's a very specific offering. And if you're interested in learning more about it, Emma can send that to you. I mean, to me, we're going to provide like the programs that are certified and validated to extract the data. It's a 5-day process, and that includes sitting down with you to look at exclusion. So to me, it doesn't have to be a trip around the world. It doesn't have to be a big consulting assignment to go figure out what you've got going on. We want to get you the information you need so you can make decisions. If there are actionable decisions to be made, then obviously there are people that can help you with that. But the first step is to really turn the lights on and understand what's going on.
Absolutely. Well, I'd just like to say a big thank you to everybody who has joined us today, and a huge thank you to the panel, Navinda, Scott, and of course you, Brian, for your expert knowledge today. We hope the session has proved to be valuable and that you're able to take away a strategy to implement in your own organization or with clients that you work with. So if you would like to explore the health check in more details, then you have my contact information there on the screen. I'll be more than happy to help, and you can always find me on LinkedIn. So thank you and have a great day.
Cool.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.